Welcome to the Polite Conversations podcast, where every episode is focused on civility, decorum, and good manners. And I'm your lovable, non-controversial host, Ina. If you know me, you know I definitely don't like to ruffle any feathers at all. A whole year of genocide. I can't believe what we've witnessed other human beings go through these past 12 months. It's been a whole year of slaughtering innocent civilians, of torturing and raping people held without charge, of blowing up children while claiming to be the most moral and civilized. A genocide constructed and justified on the basis of so many lies. It's hard to keep track of them all. Lies repeated by the leaders we're supposed to trust. Not crazy right-wing nutjobs, apparently, but on this issue they might as well be. The 40 beheaded babies, the mass rape hoaxes, the horror stories of cutting babies out of wombs, the human shielding stories, none of which turned out to be true. Whoops. Doesn't matter anyway, because our most civilized Western leaders are still shamelessly repeating those lies to this day, without feeling the need to verify or back up what they say with a shred of evidence. They continue on supplying the weapons of mass destruction, refusing to even acknowledge the basic humanity of Palestinians, and by extension, Muslims. By extension, they show us also how indigenous people in these parts were once dehumanized, abducted, eradicated, just like this, by leaders just like these ones. They show us this in real time while uttering their empty, meaningless, bland acknowledgments, fake words of empathy on days of supposed truth and reconciliation, while they continue to support and arm the same type of destruction in the present day. They regret nothing, and they clearly don't want to face the truth. Maybe they'll take a glimpse at these current atrocities they're responsible for, only when they're safely far away, decades and decades later. Right now, the urgency and willful blindness is poured into continuing the slaughter, legitimizing it on whatever weak, paper-thin excuses they can find. Excuses that, when examined, are revealed to be true about Israel itself. Every single time, the human shielding, the mass rape and torture as policy, as a weapon of war, the babies beheaded by bombs, embryos blown out of their mothers' wombs. We are living in a reality where the victims of this brutal genocide are not only not centered in the tales told of this tragedy, one of the worst of our lifetime, might I add. More children have been killed in Gaza by the genocidal Israeli military over the past year than the equivalent period of any other conflict in the past 2 decades, according to Oxfam. It's created the biggest cohort of pediatric amputees in history, according to the New Yorker, all carried out in the most high-tech, civilized ways, of course, with a new level of automation, AI-assisted, and live-streamed directly into our handheld devices, often documented by the genocide defense forces themselves. TikTok war crimes and thirst traps posted to get you on side for this endless mass murder. How can it be that bad if hot people are posting thirst traps while doing it, huh? They throw in some rainbow flags for good measure. This slaughter certainly isn't carried out by backwards homophobes, they want you to know. They really want to appeal to all your leftist values. It's a progressive, inclusive eradication of a people, you know? And this is not The Onion. Like, this is truly how they're trying to sell this thing. With photos of hot babes, diverse murderers, and rainbow flags held over the rubble of a bombed neighborhood. As I was saying before, not only are the victims of this genocide not centered in mainstream discussion about this, usually, it is the feelings of the perpetrators or supporters of this atrocity that are always a priority. Let's not offend Israel, Israelis, or Netanyahu, heaven forbid. Let's portray them in the best possible light, in fact. Give them softball interviews, regardless of their actions. Let's take them at their word, no matter how many lies they tell. What's a little genocide between friends, right? Surely we can look away because, it's uncomfortable. Let's focus on the real problem here, the barbarians in that desert region who simply won't succumb to total domination. Like, the absolute fucking nerve of them. Always causing problems. Jeez. And now they want to talk about their pain and suffering too? Like, it really feels like that's the inner monologue of most of the people in power in this dreadfully civilized Western part of the world. And they are showing it to us on repeat, unapologetically. I just can't wrap my mind around how mostly everyone in all these institutions ultimately all fall in line and utter the same meaningless prepackaged phrases, regardless of what's actually happening in the real world. Israel has a right to defend itself, while it's bombing hospitals, starving civilians, bombing neonatal units, bombing ambulances, shooting at firefighters, bombing schools and mosques. Just how are they all in such lockstep with each other? How do all the institutions we once valued come together right now to shield these atrocities from scrutiny? The media, the universities, the politicians. How is it that no meaningful number of people in these spaces have a conscience? Why aren't there more dissenting voices, despite everything we've been witnessing for a whole fucking year? I mean, of course, we've seen a trickle of people who've stood up, but it's not nearly enough. I mean, I guess I know how that happens. It's partly because in the West, we've been spoon-fed propaganda about the terrorist hordes from that region all our lives, so much so that some of us from that region can even fall for it at times. And especially since October 7th, we've been told tales of their unique evil and mindless anti-Semitism to the point where right-wing Jewish publications were willing to publish Holocaust revisionism and Nazi apologetics. Just sit with that for a second. How did we get here? Where it's so urgent to demonize the trapped, starved, defenseless Palestinians that some think it appropriate to minimize Nazi crimes in order to do so. That so many people have felt comfortable to say that there are no civilians there, that they should all be collectively punished, eradicated. Like, how? We exist in an era where we see images of shredded children interspersed with completely banal cat videos, Instagram, fashion reels, as we keep doom scrolling through the hollowed out, commodified remnants of our social media feeds. Our brains were not meant to process information like this, switching from sheer horror, death, and destruction to like cute animals or cooking, and then back to watch from afar, completely helpless as people scream in agony and beg to be saved. And our most significant public figures have simply refused to acknowledge even a fraction of the devastation in Palestine. At best, we can expect some canned, mealy-mouthed, both sides statement, where Palestinians are an afterthought, of course, which is obscene in itself. But a year on, we aren't even seeing that to a great degree. In their statements on October 7th, Biden Kamala, Obama, and Trudeau, among many other world leaders, I'm sure, continue to put out misinformation. The very misinformation that helped to construct the narrative legitimizing this genocide to begin with. The mass rapes, the idea that Hamas just wants to destroy Israel for no real reason other than blind anti-Semitism. No attempt to face the underlying issue of keeping people in a concentration camp. Just deeply, deeply unserious, empty declarations of wanting peace. And running with the numbers that Israel put out, especially considering there was no real inquiry into the fact that Israeli media has been reporting since soon after October 7th that the IDF ordered use of force on its own people, killing we don't know how many, to prevent Hamas from taking soldiers captive. The very foundation of this event, October 7th, that turned this slow, ongoing genocide of the Palestinians into a full-blown, fast-paced one, is based on a falsehood, on inaccurate numbers. There were undoubtedly murders and war crimes committed by Hamas, but also murder by Israel of its own people, and we're just going to collectively ignore that? Don't take it from me, take it from the Israeli media. I mean, the Israeli people themselves should be outraged and demanding answers and accountability from their own government on this specific issue. And how is it that when Israel bombs a literal fucking orphanage, not a word of condemnation is uttered by our politicians? Like, that is cartoon villain levels of evil. But if Iran strikes a military target in response to provocation and doesn't kill civilians, it's still framed as a barbaric, unprovoked escalation. I cannot get my head around how they're so bold and brazen with their lying, their gaslighting, their hypocrisy. I guess it's because it doesn't matter. It's starting to feel like we can't hold our leaders accountable at all. The media falls right in line, and if someone doesn't, there's a personal price to pay. If there's a politician out of line, there's a heavy price to pay for them too. There's pressure to have people fired, to have their careers destroyed, to have them associated with false charges of anti-Semitism. And everyone with any power at all just goes along with it. And you know, us in the West, we really value free speech and dissenting opinions. We don't have blasphemy laws like those desert savages, except for when you say something about Israel. The free speech culture warriors are particularly silent nowadays, huh? It's unreal. I mean, this is a genocidal regime under which we've seen the encouragement and celebration of starving an entire civilian population. Torture and rape of innocent civilians. People brought their children and turned the starvation of Palestinians into a family picnic. We saw literal bouncy castles for starvation. We've seen right to rape rallies erupt in a society that is clearly very deeply unwell, and it is our Western countries that are its enablers. Our media tying itself into linguistic knots to exonerate the ones carrying this out. Can you imagine the response if any of this had been happening in a Muslim country? Like, can you imagine? All of this has really had me question everything. How can it be that we exist in a nightmare reality that despite endless documentation and video evidence, our leaders cannot center the victims of this genocide, cannot acknowledge their humanity in the slightest? How is it that the slaughterers are centered and portrayed as victims? How can this distorted version of the truth be acceptable to anyone, let alone large swaths of our society? In all this, I've been thinking of and rethinking so many things, the different ways racism takes shape, the ways in which bigotries mirror one another, how so many struggles of marginalized groups are interconnected. I've been thinking about my own identity as a person of color, my own experiences with racism, my identity as an atheist, as a person of Muslim background, as someone who has called the West home for half my life now, and how it's going to be to function in this place I trusted and loved from now on. And there's just a lot to unpack here. It's really changed me forever. I know I keep saying this, but I can't quite express the magnitude of how much it's changed me. I might need to do a whole separate identity-related episode for that. I also think about how I've never hesitated to criticize Islamist extremism. I've never hesitated to criticize the countries that I belong to, where I feel there's plenty of valid criticism. I cannot then comprehend how there are so many who claim to be rational and objective who are simply so blinded now by their ideological biases, by their quote-unquote tribalism, their Western chauvinism, that when the shoe is on the other foot, when it comes to condemning extremist ideologies supported and enabled in Western societies, they just can't even begin to grapple with it, and are basically comparable to the worst Islamist apologists I've ever encountered. In the past week or two, I've consumed so much awful media that it's hard to really pick what I want to focus on here because there's so much of it. I've seen Douglas Murray talk about a civilizational G-spot with Barry Weiss. A bit on the nose there, Douglas. I mean, come on. You know he gets hard. Just thinking about colonizing and civilizing savages. He's been having a real blast, no pun intended, for the past year, where Israel has found a great brand ambassador in posh white nationalist Douglas Murray. That alone should tell you everything you need to know about Israel in its current form. Then there's Sam Harris, who wrote a piece titled something like, "Sometimes violence really is the answer." Just imagine if an Arab or Muslim wrote something like that, let alone something that was trying to justify a literal terrorist attack, justify exploding devices that killed children. Just imagine what Sam Harris himself would be saying about someone like that. I just don't know how these fasci fucks with openly violent, genocidal fantasies are still acceptable in polite society. I mean, I guess polite society is pretty fucking fasci in these parts, as we've truly seen the extent of over the last year. We know Harris loves his inflammatory, gimmicky headlines in defense of torture, in defense of profiling, because he enjoys the cheap attention grab, I suppose, and then he enjoys whining about being taken out of context and playing the victim. But it goes further than just gimmicky headlines. His whole project for years now has been about rationalizing extreme anti-Muslim bigotry in particular, and really delegitimizing anti-racism with all his strength and energy. Are you sensing a theme here? But it's not Harris's right-wing bullshit I want to focus on today, since we have a whole spectrum of Israel defenders and minimizers in our media. From deranged, violence-loving right-wingers like Sam Harris to otherwise liberal and progressive-seeming pundits like Jon Stewart, who lean heavily into the minimizing. There's almost nowhere to go in the mainstream for consistent, honest, straightforward journalism or commentary on what's happening here. And there's just so much despicable stuff that's just constantly being swept under the rug. It's maddening, truly. Just today I heard about in Toronto a doctor who's returned from Gaza speaking to a mainstream news channel, and the cameraman just walked away saying he's not going to do it. Like, The reporter was reporting, and his cameraman walked away from this doctor who has been on the ground in Gaza talking about the horrors that he's witnessed. Like, just imagine that happening in any other situation, during any other atrocity. Then there's this recent CBS morning interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, where Tony Dokupo simply couldn't contain his frothing at the mouth hatred and racism. And Ta-Nehisi Coates really kept his cool and kept his focus in such a masterful way. But we know which one Sam Harris would call a pornographer of race, eh? And this interview was just a perfect crystallization of how. Please subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes to access the extended version of this episode, where I'll dive into the recent controversies surrounding that Ta-Nehisi Coates interview on CBS, as well as Jon Stewart's recent chat with Coates. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support it, there are several ways you can do that. You can share it online, talk about what you just heard. You can leave a 5-star review to help others find it too. And you can also subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes. No E in mangoes. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter before it's completely wrecked, you'll find me at Nice Mangoes. Again, no E in mangoes.